Member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll be sharing my time with the member for Haliburton. Mr. Speaker, it is great to see you back in person. It has been far too long and so much has changed. For one, you are the proud owner of another $10,000 of debt. Yet that is the per capita share of every man, woman, and child in Canada. $380 billion deficit this year for 38 million Canadians equals $10,000 per Canadian, or $40,000 for a family of four. Now, I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but I haven't met a lot of people who will tell me that their family has received $40,000 in COVID relief benefits. In fact, even if you received the CERB for a full 16 weeks, that works out to $8,000. And the majority of Canadians did not even receive that CERB. Although their mortgage is $40,000 bigger, they do not have $40,000 worth of benefits to show for it. So often that is the case with trickle-down government. The hardworking taxpayer has to climb the bureaucratic mountain with a big bucket of water on his back, and that water is then poured into the federal bureaucracy. It is sloshed around down to provincial bureaucracies and municipal bureaucracies, and then given on to other delivery bodies. And just as he gets back to the bottom of that bureaucratic mountain, there's a few drops that trickle down back into that bucket that he so laboriously took to the top of the hill in the first place. Now, the government will tell that taxpayer and all Canadians that we are in a crisis, thus justifying a deficit of this magnitude. And it is true. We do have a crisis. Now, we will put aside for a moment the fact that the government made the crisis worse by allowing tens of thousands of people from the most infected regions of the world to come into the country after military intelligence warned them of the danger. We will ignore the fact that many of the programs they designed since that time punished businesses for reopening and punished workers for working. We will ignore all of those failings and grant that indeed this is a crisis. But it's not our first crisis. Indeed, we've fought world wars, we've had the Great Depression, the Great Recession. So how does this deficit compare to those deficits? It wouldn't be fair just to point out that our $380 billion deficit is 7 times the previous all-time record, because that doesn't adjust for GDP and inflation. So to be fair, let's compare the deficit as a share of GDP in inflation-adjusted terms. This year, the federal deficit is 17% of GDP. To compare, in the worst year of World War I, it was 8% of GDP. In the worst year of the Great Depression, it was 6% of GDP. In the worst year of the Great Global Recession, it was 4% of GDP. To put it in perspective, our deficit today is twice what it was in World War I, 3 times what it was in the Great Depression, and 4 times what it was in the Great Global Recession, all adjusted for the economy and inflation. Only once in our history has the deficit been bigger as a share of our economy, and that was in 1943. 1943, when the government was selling bonds to its people so that it could fight Hitler and Mussolini and Imperial Japan. They put those dollars to work to win the war, and yes, they had a deficit of 23% of GDP in that year. But you know what was different? When our soldiers came back from battle, you might have expected that, exhausted and heartbroken from loss, that they would want to take a prolonged vacation and put on the national credit card and let future generations pay the bill. But they did exactly the opposite. You know how long it took our grandparents to balance the budget after they got back from the war? 1 year. 1 year. And within 2 years, they were running the largest budget surplus in Canadian history, 5% of GDP, the equivalent of $120 billion in today's relative terms. They fought for our freedom, and then they fought for our finances. Imagine if we had a government today with even a modicum of the integrity and respect and honor that our grandparents had those many years ago. Wouldn't we be in much better shape? But here we are today with a Prime Minister that not only effortlessly and carelessly spends our money, he tells us that money is not even a real thing anymore. Yesterday, in his bizarre address to the nation, he told us that spending more actually costs less. I'm not joking. You can look it up. That's what he actually said. Spending more money costs less. You know, it's clearly things now mean the opposite of what they say. This is not 1947. This is 1984. And we have a government engaged in doublespeak about the meaning of money. Now, they tell us that we can afford all of this debt because interest rates are low. And they're right, interest rates are incredibly low, stoked by the fact that central banks are producing an unprecedented amount of fake money through keystrokes at their bureaus. But those rates are not going to be low forever. Unless you believe that the debt will be paid off before the rates rise, then you have to believe that we've got trouble down the road. This government is not planning to pay back the debt ever. In fact, its own projections suggest that the debt will grow every year forever. And so, are they really expecting us to believe that never in the future will we return to normal levels of interest rates? Let me put it into perspective. This year, the effective interest rate across all of our debt will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 2%. That's not the bond yield today, but it's the average across the entire stock of federal debt, about 2%. The average over the last 2 decades is 5%. Do you know what the difference is between 5% and 2%? Someone said 3. They'll almost be right. 5% is more than double 2%. It is an increase of over 100%. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it is a massive increase and a massive change in our budget picture. When you more than double the interest rate applying to over $1 trillion of debt, you massively increase the amount of money diverted from social programs into the hands of wealthy and greedy bondholders, those people who lend us their money. They're not in charity, Mr. Speaker. They're in it for profit. So let's calculate what every point of increase would cost. It's very simple. At $1 trillion debt, it's about $10 billion in new annual costs for the taxpayer every time interest rates go up by just 1 percentage point. So if they went up 3 percentage points to the normal average over the course of the medium term, 4 or 5 years, we would be paying an extra $30 billion a year to service our debt. $30 billion a year is almost what we collect in GST revenues. Imagine this government in their back pocket keeping open the prospect of doubling the GST in order to pay for the cost associated with interest rates returning merely to their normal average levels. That is the risk that they are taking with our future. So what could we do differently? The answer is this. The answer is jobs, jobs, jobs. The only way to tackle this massive debt beast that our current government is creating is by returning our mighty workers to their jobs. Right now, we have 1 million missing jobs relative to the number of people who were working in February before COVID began. We now have the highest unemployment rate in the G7. Our unemployment rate at over 10% is 3 percentage points higher than the OECD average. We need a plan to unleash the free market system to hire people back, get out of the way, and let our mines, plants, and factories come roaring back to life? Why don't we let our steel workers and trades workers build pipelines that will create jobs in the energy sector in the West and the refining sector in the East? Get out of the way of small businesses by cutting red tape and lowering taxes on those entrepreneurs so they bring our main streets buzzing back to life. It is only through a bigger and broader economy that we can pay the prodigious costs associated with this government to continue to put food on the table and provide for our vital social safety net. That is the plan. That is what we must do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kings Hants.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's great to see you virtually. I want to thank you and the entire staff for all their work to make sure that parliamentarians outside of Ottawa can be a part of this. I'd like to thank the member from Carleton for his speech. He's very eloquent, and I always make sure that I point that out. Very strong on his feet. A couple of questions that I have for the member from Carleton is this. Economists around the world and indeed in Canada have justified the spending that the government of Canada has done. Indeed, he and his own party at the height of the pandemic was actually pushing our government to do even more. So how can he square the fact that our government has responded? They were asking for more. And it's funny, Mr. Speaker, I told my constituents, this is how the Conservatives will play ball. They will ask us to do more. 6 months later, they'll say you've spent too much. So what program would the member from Carleton cut? Which program that we've introduced would he not have supported?
The honourable member for Carleton.
I thank the member for his question. I congratulate him on his election to this place. So let me start off by saying we would not have done bigger. We would have done better. We would have, for example, created an income replacement program that rewarded people for going back to work rather than punishing them for it. These guys created a program that kicked people off the CERB the second they earned more than a dollar more than 1,000. If you committed the crime of working 9 days for a minimum wage, you would be kicked under this Liberal government from the CERB to the curb. How many people were prevented from getting back to work by that punitive anti-work policy? Then they punished businesses for recuperating lost revenues by kicking them off rent and wage subsidies. All of that suppressed revenue and prevented our businesses and our workers from getting back on their feet. That would have significantly, if done differently, would have significantly reduced the deficit cost.
Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Jonquière.
The honourable member for Jonquière. I appreciated my colleague's speech. He loves a balanced book in our public world. Unfortunately, when the government had to do so in the past, they did so by cutting equalization, $2.5 billion in 96-97, I believe, in 97 and 98, 2.5 billion less again in cuts to equalization, especially in healthcare. Now, we know that the way to come out of this crisis will be difficult. Two questions. Does he agree with the shameful strategy of cutting equalization payments to provinces to balance public books? Does he agree with what provincial premiers have asked for, which is a 35% increase of equalisation payments in healthcare? The honourable member for Carleton. I would like to thank my colleague for his question. First of all, he's right. Every time the Liberals empty our coffers, they cut healthcare. They did so in the 90s. That is unequivocally true. In 96, for example, the Government of Canada had no more money. So what did the Liberals do at the time? They increased taxes on workers. They cut their investments in healthcare. That is what the Liberals do every single time. And we would be remiss not to think that they might do that again next time that there is no more money because of their irresponsible spending. However, during the Harper years, we eliminated the deficit that came from the great global recession by increasing health transfers because we were able to better spend public money. We got rid of waste and we better targeted our investments to provinces. In every single year of the Harper government, we increased spending in healthcare. That's what we can do. The only way to protect our social programs is by having a strong economy and protected finances. Thank you.
Debate. The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's great to be in this place and address Parliament for the first time in many weeks. Of course, the Prime Minister prorogued Parliament, taking away this opportunity to do so. So it's great to be back here. It's great to see you and my colleagues on all sides of the aisle once again. And I don't think it's any secret that the Prime Minister, we all know, decided to prorogue Parliament because of his involvement in the WE charity scandal. So, Speaker, following the words from the Governor-General, there was absolutely nothing in the Prime Minister's address last night on prime time that couldn't have been announced in any normal press briefing or even here on the floor of the House of Commons. The Prime Minister, of course, as many are saying, pulled the wool over the eyes of our network executives, claiming that it wasn't partisan politics, but an address to the nation on COVID-19. Now we all know after the fact the address was entirely political, providing further evidence that prorogation was all about distraction. Now, the nation was treated to the Liberal love for a whole bunch of words about nothing, proudly exclaiming that we're building back better. I think a more accurate slogan is building a better or worse bloated bureaucracy. Now, I'm sure that slogan did not run as well with focus groups. But, Speaker, the Prime Minister warned Canadians that we might not be able to gather for Thanksgiving dinner in just a few weeks. However, he did serve up his own turkey dinner last night, offering a throne speech overflowing with every failed Liberal promise of the last 5 years and then some. Canadians love their turkey dinner, but you can only eat so much, Speaker. Leftovers get tiresome after a while, and you need to throw them out. Like reheated turkey, 7 days later, Canadians are now asking themselves, maybe it's time to throw the Liberals out. The throne speech contained a dizzying number of major policy commitments underwritten by ongoing deficits and debt. Indeed, Speaker, the speech began with the proclamation that this is not the time for austerity. It seems to Liberals that anything short of massive federal spending and bureaucracy equals austerity. To quote the honourable member for Carleton, who just spoke on Twitter yesterday, the truest statement in that throne speech was this: we own an immense debt. Now, Speaker, recent polling suggests that more than half the country is quite concerned about the recent run-up of deficits and debt. Canadians are asking the government to balance support for emergency pandemic measures with fiscal responsibility, a task that this Liberal government is clearly not up for, opting rather to burden future generations with massive deficit-financed expansion of government. The throne speech outlined how the Liberals plan on paying for their grand ideas, or actually failed to outline that. And you've heard it before, many times. Just simply tax the rich. Now, let's be clear to everyone, including the wealthy, they need to pay their fair share of taxes. The problem is, when you raise taxes substantially, people stop trying to earn that amount of money which is being overtaxed. The formula the Liberals like to use is that if we raise taxes at the top, we can then transfer it to the bottom. However, the Liberals did try that. They tried that already. You might remember the government increased the top tax rate on Canada's top 1%. It was just happened a few years ago. What happened, though, Speaker? Well, according to the Globe and Mail, high-income earners in 2016 paid $4.6 billion less in federal taxes, despite Liberal pledges that the new top tax bracket would raise around $3 billion in additional revenue. So that means a larger burden is taken from the middle to make up for what is lost. And there's no other way to do it other than what the Liberals were doing was deficit financing their promises. If you simply tax businesses more, jobs are shed. The costs, if they're able to survive, are then passed on to consumers, increasing the cost of living. Now, whether you're rich or otherwise, there's a certain point where you're not going to stick around and be bled to death. And not to mention that most predictions about taxing the rich by the left are rarely accounting for the large change in behavior. And they also, by that measure, end up overestimating the tax revenue. And despite the easy target they are, it isn't good when wealthy people leave your jurisdiction, your province, or your country. When you raise the tax rate to a level that is too high, it leads to significant legal and illegal tax avoidance strategies. and lowers work effort, including labor force participation. Liberals know they can't balance the budget by increasing the top marginal tax rate, but they push those lines anyways. This is called the Tytler cycle, Lord Alexander Tytler. Now, it works, or I should say doesn't work, by promising a growing number of gifts of largesse from the Treasury, but not actually saying how it will be paid. Now, if you think people are going to sit idly by and let the government take, you're absolutely unrealistic. And don't forget, whether you're wealthy, you're middle class or otherwise, if you're investing in anything, stocks, in real estate, whatever, it's done with after-tax dollars. So having said all of that, the left usually will say they have a plan for the economy. They always have a plan. They always seem to be planning. But what it really means is they want to have a bunch of bureaucrats and academics lay out a gaggle of endless government programs. In other words, central planning. But you know, if one plan fails, they'll make another plan. As Ronald Reagan famously said, the more the plans fail, the more the planners will plan. Now, conservatives believe that we need to cut taxes, ensure regulations are at a reasonable level, and give people the freedom to judge on their own, to provide for their families, to give to charity, to protect the most vulnerable, and give them basically the ability to do which is best in their particular situation, because a one-size-fits-all situation does not work. We need freedom. We need the ability for choice. And that's why socialism always fails, because there's no incentive. There's no incentive to improve your situation. Really, why do Canadians work extra hours? Why would a farmer get up at 5 a.m. to plow that field? Why does a trucker drive an extra kilometer? Why does a mechanic take an extra car in the shop at the end of the day? Why do people work a double shift? It's because people want things, and things cost money. But economic growth, Speaker, comes from people exchanging goods and services for dollars in terms of employment, or hours of the day in terms of dollars, in exchange for dollars. So if you're going to continually grow government, where does this money come from if wealthy people are bad, if growth is bad, if the free market is bad, if individuals choosing between necessity and the trivial is bad? What tree does that money come from? If everything comes from government, Speaker, in other words, if everything comes from government, who actually pays for government? Speaker, I'll point to childcare. It falls under my portfolio as the new Shadow Minister for Families, Children and Social Development. I want to first thank the Minister for his service to our country, and although we don't always agree on policy, I do look forward to working with him, making life more affordable for Canadian families, and to ensure that those families get the support they need during these trying times. So let's talk about the childcare commitment, or their plan. Let's start with their plan. It was promised in 1993. This is ongoing, so if anyone actually believes they're finally going to get around to it, So, Speaker, so I'll do this quick. I know 2 minutes left. Okay, let's talk about childcare. So we want to ensure that families have more money in their pockets so that they're able to make choice. And we know that the one-size-fits-all, Ottawa knows best government institution isn't going to work for a number of people. Is it going to work for shift workers? Probably not. Is it going to work for people who need variables in their situation? Probably not, because you get what you're given, whether you like it or not, whether you want it or not, under this situation. Our plan is calling for freedom, the freedom for parents to make the choice that works best for them in their situation. Now, what the government is also doing is encroaching in provincial jurisdiction, because we all know childcare is in provincial jurisdiction. And what does that do when the federal government says to the provinces and territories, you are going to do this or else you do not get your money? It takes away competition. And we as Conservatives know that in many cases, whether it be internet, what have you, one of the best ways to fix a problem is competition. So if Ottawa is telling the provinces how to operate their childcare services, how do we actually fix the problem? The rich will go outside the system. Everyone else is to take what they get. Whereas if the Conservative plan, which encourages competition, which encourages money back in your pocket, more money back in your pocket, you can actually gauge through competition, say, well, what Manitoba is doing in childcare, that works really well. Maybe us in whatever province, New Brunswick, we have a few challenges. Maybe we can take that best practices and incorporate it into our own provincial situation, improving the lives of those who need childcare in our communities. More local control, more provincial control is what we're talking about in the childcare conversation, rather than Ottawa telling the provinces what to do. And as we all know, the Liberals have been promising that since 1993, so the fact that we expect them to get it done now, I find that very hard to believe. I see you're looking at me, so I will wind that down. Thank you, Speaker, for the time.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to congratulate my colleague on his new responsibilities as being a critic for family and family services. But I did want to just ask him and touch on something. He talked about a promise that a previous Liberal government had made, and a promise had been made to deliver on a national child care program. A promise was set up. And it was signed by all 10 provinces. The plan was ready to go. As we heard earlier, we ended up in an election. The Liberals lost power at that time. It went to the Conservatives. And then 2 years later, the Conservatives completely canceled that plan. And they left the plan on the floor. And then they had another 8 years where they could have brought something else forward. I understand his criticism of the previous government not doing anything to bring forward, or for taking a while to bring forward a plan. But does he not bear some responsibility that the former Conservative government dropped the entire program, cancelled it, and then brought nothing else forward in its place?
Or Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to my friend across the way. It's good to see him back in this place as well. A couple of things there. The deal that my friend was talking about took almost over 10 years to come up with in the first place.